Hey everyone, and welcome to your daily dose of what's got the tech world talking. Yesterday on Hacker News, we sifted through 30 stories to bring you the 5 that really captured the community's attention. And wow, did we see some passionate debates. We've got everything from a massive privacy battle brewing in Europe that could reshape how we think about encrypted messaging, to researchers literally breaking into Microsoft's own systems using their authentication tools. Plus, we'll dive into the surprisingly heated world of grammar debates in tech, explore the wild west of free AI coding tools, and look at why a simple VPN service has the community so divided. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. Story 1. Fight Chat Control. Let's kick things off with the story that absolutely dominated the discussion yesterday, with nearly 900 points and over 250 comments. And honestly, this one deserves every bit of that attention, because what's happening in Europe right now could fundamentally change digital privacy as we know it. Now, we need to talk about something that's got the Hacker News community absolutely fired up, and for good reason. The story is Fight Chat Control, and it's about the EU's latest attempt to fundamentally reshape digital privacy as we know it. So here's what's happening. The EU is pushing this proposal called Chat Control that would essentially turn every messaging app, every photo you send, every private conversation into something that gets automatically scanned. We're talking about 450 million EU citizens having their communications monitored without any suspicion, without consent, just blanket surveillance. And the kicker? This includes encrypted messages. Yeah, the same end-to-end encryption that's supposed to keep your conversations private from everyone except you and the person you're talking to. The current state of play is pretty tense. 15 member states are backing this, 3 are opposed, and 9 are still on the fence. Those 9 countries, they're basically holding the future of digital privacy in their hands right now. What really gets me about this whole thing is the sheer audacity of it. The politicians pushing this have actually exempted themselves from the surveillance under something called professional secrecy rules. So let me get this straight. They want to scan every message you send to your doctor, your lawyer, your spouse, but their own communications? Oh, no, those are off limits. The hypocrisy is just breathtaking. And here's where it gets even more twisted. This whole thing is being sold as protecting children, right? But actual child protection experts, including the UN, are saying this would make kids less safe, not more. Think about it. If you break encryption for scanning, you're not just letting the good guys in. You're creating vulnerabilities that criminals, hackers, authoritarian governments can exploit. That sensitive medical data about your kid, those photos from their birthday party, all potentially exposed because we've deliberately weakened the security infrastructure that protects them. The Hacker News discussion around this is fascinating because it reveals this isn't happening in isolation. One commenter pointed out that while everyone's focused on chat control, the EU Parliament just quietly voted through mandatory age verification for adult content, with prison sentences for non-compliance. And that story barely made a ripple in the media. It's like we're watching this systematic expansion of surveillance capabilities happening in real time, piece by piece. What's really striking in the comments is this sense of exhaustion almost. People are pointing out this is like the 5th attempt in 10 years to push through something like this. They keep trying, getting pushed back, rebranding it, trying again. One user, Fendrin AD2, had this interesting take. They think the EU will ultimately back down, that politicians just want to look like they're doing something about child safety without actually implementing something this draconian. I'm not so optimistic, honestly. The technical implications here are staggering. We're not just talking about reading your WhatsApp messages. To make this work, they'd need to fundamentally break or backdoor the encryption protocols that secure everything from your banking apps to your medical records. It's like demanding that every lock manufacturer include a master key that opens every lock they've ever made, then promising that only the good guys will use it. History has shown us exactly how well that works out. There's this website that's been set up to track which politicians and countries support this, and even that became controversial. The creator initially marked MEPs as supporting the measure if their government supported it, which Yeah, that caused some pushback. They since changed it, but it shows how murky the political maneuvering around this has become. What really concerns me is the precedent this sets globally. Once the EU, which likes to position itself as a defender of privacy rights, implements mass surveillance like this, what's to stop other countries from pointing to it and saying, well, if the EU does it, why can't we? It's creating a blueprint for surveillance that authoritarian regimes would absolutely love to copy. The community's discussing workarounds, VPNs, alternative platforms, but that's missing the bigger picture. We shouldn't have to route around our own government surveillance apparatus. The fact that people are already planning their digital escape routes tells you everything about where this is headed. And you know what's really maddening? The same politicians pushing this probably use Signal or other encrypted apps for their own sensitive communications. They understand the value of privacy when it's their conversations, their data, their security at stake. But for the rest of us, apparently, we can't be trusted with that same level of protection. This isn't just about privacy versus security. It's about whether we want to live in a world where every digital interaction is potentially monitored, stored, analyzed, where the assumption is guilt until proven innocent, where the very tools that protect whistleblowers, journalists, activists, and yes, ordinary citizens just trying to live their lives are deliberately compromised in the name of safety. The fight against chat control isn't just another tech policy debate. It's about defining what kind of digital future we're building. And right now, those 9 undecided EU member states are basically writing that future for us. Speaking of security and trust, let's talk about what happens when even the biggest tech companies can't get their own security right. This next story had the community absolutely roasting Microsoft. And honestly, they kind of deserve it. Our next story is abusing Entra OAuth for fun and access to internal Microsoft applications. And yes, you heard that right. Researchers managed to break into Microsoft's own internal systems using vulnerabilities in their own authentication platform. This is one of those stories that's both technically fascinating and, honestly, kind of embarrassing for Microsoft. Security researchers discovered they could exploit weaknesses in Microsoft's Entra OAuth implementation. That's the service formerly known as Azure AD, to gain unauthorized access to applications that were supposed to be restricted to Microsoft employees only. We're talking about internal tools here, systems that should have been locked down tighter than Fort Knox. What makes this particularly juicy is the method they used. The researchers found flaws in how Microsoft was validating OAuth tokens. Basically, they could manipulate the authentication flow and bypass security controls that should have stopped them cold. They weren't just poking at the edges here. They demonstrated actual access to internal Microsoft applications. And get this, according to the discussion on Hacker News, some of these vulnerable systems included things that could have potentially compromised Windows build servers. Think about that for a second. The implications for the global software supply chain if someone malicious had found this first. The community reaction has been, well, it's been brutal. With 335 points and over 100 comments, people are not holding back. One of the biggest points of frustration, Microsoft apparently offered these researchers a grand total of $0 for their bug bounty submission. Zero. For vulnerabilities that could have exposed critical internal infrastructure. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The discussion thread is full of developers sharing their own horror stories about working with Entra and Azure AD. Multiple commenters describe the documentation as, and I'm paraphrasing here but not by much, an incomprehensible nightmare. One person said it's like navigating through circular references that lead nowhere, with documentation that seems almost designed to confuse rather than clarify. Another developer mentioned spending weeks trying to implement what should have been basic OAuth flows, only to find that the official guidance contradicts itself in different places. There's this fascinating insider perspective, too. A former Microsoft PM jumped into the thread to clarify that the actual recommended guidance is more nuanced than what the article suggests. According to them, you're supposed to validate both the tenant ID and the subject, not just the tenant alone. But even with that clarification, other commenters pointed out that if Microsoft's own internal teams can't get this right, what hope do external developers have? What really struck me about this whole situation is a comment someone made about security architecture failures. They pointed out that Microsoft had these internal applications exposed to the internet in the first place. Like, forget OAuth for a second. Why weren't these behind a proper network security layer? It's violating one of the most basic principles of defense in depth. You don't put your internal tools on the public internet and rely solely on authentication to protect them. And there's this broader conversation happening about whether OAuth itself is fundamentally flawed in how it conflates authentication with authorization. Some folks in the thread are arguing this isn't entirely Microsoft's fault, that it's a systemic issue with how we've all collectively decided to implement OAuth. But then others counter that Microsoft literally created Entra. They're one of the biggest tech companies in the world. If anyone should get this right, it's them. The whole thing really highlights how even the biggest players in tech can have these fundamental security gaps. It's a reminder that complex authentication systems are, well, they're really complex, and that complexity creates attack surfaces that even the experts sometimes miss. When the company that builds the authentication platform can't properly secure their own implementation of it, it really makes you wonder about the state of security across the entire ecosystem of applications using these services. Now, speaking of security and convenience trade-offs, let's look at a tool that's got the Hacker News community completely divided, and the debate around it really crystallizes some fundamental tensions in how we think about modern networking and privacy. Next up, let's talk about how I use Tailscale. This one really struck a chord on Hacker News with over 350 points and 90 comments. And honestly, it's fascinating to see how divided the community is on this one. So here's the deal. Someone shared their 4-year journey with Tailscale, which, if you're not familiar, is basically this slick wrapper around WireGuard that promises to make connecting your devices dead simple. And I mean dead simple. The author's big selling point is that you literally just install it, log in, and boom, all your devices can talk to each other securely, even if they're buried behind multiple routers or on completely different networks. What really caught my attention, though, is how they're using it. They've got this feature called Magic DNS that automatically gives your devices memorable names. So instead of trying to remember that your Raspberry Pi is at 192.168. whatever, you just type Raspberry Pi and you're there. Pretty neat, right? But here's where it gets interesting. They're also using Tailscale for SSH authentication, which means if you're logged into Tailscale, you can SSH into any machine on your network without dealing with SSH keys or passwords. The service just handles it. Now, the author's clearly a fan. They've been using it for 4 years and are singing its praises about the generous free tier and how it just works. But oh boy, the comments section tells a different story. There's this fascinating tension between people who love the convenience and others who are basically saying, "Are you kidding me with this privacy nightmare?" See, it turns out Tailscale collects a lot of data. We're talking real-time monitoring of your network connections, and on mobile devices, you can't even turn it off. One commenter pointed out that they're logging everything: which devices are talking to each other, when they're connecting, how much data they're moving around. And for a tool that's supposed to be about private networking, that's raising some serious eyebrows. The security debate got pretty heated too. While the author article loves that SSH authentication feature I mentioned, some folks in the comments are basically saying, hold up, you're replacing a well-understood, battle-tested authentication system with what exactly? They're arguing it's less transparent and potentially introduces new attack vectors. One person made a really good point about defense and depth. Like, sure, convenience is nice, but not at the cost of security fundamentals. What's really interesting about this whole discussion is that it really crystallizes this fundamental tension in modern tech. On one side, you've got this incredibly convenient service that genuinely solves real problems. The author isn't wrong. Traditional VPN setups can be a pain. Managing WireGuard keys manually is tedious, and Tailscale really does make it stupidly easy to connect your devices. On the other hand, you've got valid concerns about privacy, security, and independence. One commenter summed it up perfectly. They said something like, Tailscale is great until it isn't. And that's the thing. When it works, it's magical. But what happens when they change their pricing, or get acquired, or have a security breach, or just decide to pivot their business model? The discussion also touched on something I think is really important: the fact that Tailscale's clients are open source, but their control plane isn't. It's this weird middle ground where they're being transparent enough to build trust, but not so transparent that you can easily replicate their service. Smart business move? Maybe. But it's also why projects like Headscale exist. People want that transparency all the way through. You know what really stood out to me, though? The number of people who said they started with Tailscale to test things out, loved it, and then moved to Headscale or another self-hosted solution once they understood what they actually needed. It's almost like Tailscale is accidentally serving as this gateway drug to self-hosted networking, which probably isn't their intended business model. All right, so moving into our next story, and this one really caught my eye: how I code with AI on a budget/free. This absolutely blew up on Hacker News with 575 points and nearly 200 comments. And honestly, after diving into it, I can see why. So picture this: a developer who's figured out how to basically run their own personal AI coding assistant sweatshop, except instead of people, it's dozens of browser tabs all running different free AI services simultaneously. We're talking 15, 20, sometimes more tabs open at once. Claude here, Gemini there, some Chinese models I'd never even heard of before reading this. It's like, remember when people used to have multiple search engines open to compare results? This is that, but on steroids and for coding. What's fascinating here is the sheer resourcefulness. The author calls it their AI buffet approach, and I love that metaphor because it's exactly what they're doing, sampling a little bit from everywhere without paying for the all-you-can-eat premium subscription anywhere. They're essentially crowdsourcing solutions from multiple AI brains at once. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. They're not just using the usual suspects. Sure, they've got Claude and Gemini in the mix, but they're also tapping into these Chinese AI models, GLM 4.5 from Zipua.ai, something called Kimi K2, QN3 Coder, and they're claiming these are as good as, or sometimes better than Claude 4, and completely free. That's kind of a big deal, right? I mean, if true, it suggests the AI landscape might be shifting in ways we haven't fully appreciated yet. The community response to this has been wild. You've got people in the comments sharing their own setups, and it turns out this multi-tab chaos is more common than you'd think. One particularly interesting thread developed around this counterintuitive finding. Apparently, copying and pasting code into web chat interfaces often gives better results than using those fancy IDE integrations like Cursor or GitHub Copilot. Yeah, the workflow is awkward as hell, but the results speak for themselves. There's this whole surgical approach people are talking about too, using smaller, faster models for specific tasks rather than always reaching for the biggest, most expensive option. It's like, why use a sledgehammer when a scalpel will do? Users are finding that if you give precise enough instructions, these smaller models can actually outperform the giants on specific tasks. But let me tell you about the part that made me pause. OpenAI Playground apparently gives you free tokens if you let them use your data for model training. It's that classic Silicon Valley bargain, your privacy for their services. The author's pretty blasé about it, but man, that's a trade-off worth thinking about. You're literally feeding the machine that might replace you with your own code. The discussion thread is full of people sharing their favorite free tiers. Google's giving away 1 million tokens per day on Gemini. DeepSeek has generous limits. QN's practically unlimited for certain models. It's like a treasure map of free AI resources, honestly. Now, not everyone's on board with this approach. There's this one commenter, Broke Grammar, who's like, this is insane. I'd rather just write the code myself than manage 20 browser tabs. And you know what? Fair point. There's definitely a complexity overhead here that might not be worth it for everyone. And then there's the skeptic in the room, someone basically asking why we're using these pointless AI assistants at all, suggesting they're making code quality worse. It's a minority view in this thread, but it's worth considering. Are we so focused on the how of using AI that we're not asking enough about the why? What strikes me most about this whole thing is what it says about the current state of AI coding tools. Here we have developers, presumably skilled ones, going to these lengths to avoid paying for premium services. They're willing to deal with the hassle of juggling dozens of tabs, copying and pasting between interfaces, dealing with rate limits and session timeouts, all to save, what, 30, 50 bucks a month? It either means the premium services aren't providing enough value to justify their cost, or developers are just incredibly resourceful when it comes to getting tools for free. Probably both, honestly. The Chinese AI angle is something we should probably pay more attention to. If models like GLM 4.5 and Kimi K2 really are competitive with Claude and GPT-4 and they're free, that changes the game. It's not just about cost anymore. It's about access and competition in the AI space. Story 5, try and. And finally, because sometimes the most heated debates on Hacker News aren't about technology at all, let's close out with something that sparked way more controversy than you'd expect. The difference between try and versus try to. All right, so here's something that really caught my eye on Hacker News today, try and versus try to. And wow, did this one spark a debate. This Yale linguistics piece got over 450 points and more than 230 comments. And honestly, after diving into the discussion, I totally get why. You know how sometimes you catch yourself saying, try and do something instead of try to do something? Maybe you've never even thought about it, or maybe it's one of those things that drives you absolutely crazy when you hear it. Well, turns out there's a whole linguistic rabbit hole here that's way more interesting than you'd expect. So the community discussion went in some fascinating directions. First off, there's this semantic distinction that I'd never really considered before. Apparently, when you say try to do something, you're expressing uncertainty about whether you'll actually accomplish it. But try and do something, and this blew my mind a bit, actually suggests you expect to succeed. It's like try to is pessimistic, while try and is optimistic. One commenter pointed out that when you say, I'll try and call you later, you're basically saying you will call, you're just being modest about it. But try to call you later means, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. And here's where it gets really interesting from a tech perspective, especially for anyone working in international teams or building products for global audiences. This isn't just an English quirk. Similar constructions exist in Norwegian, Danish, and even Japanese. There's this pattern across multiple languages where coordinating conjunctions like and get used in ways that seem grammatically weird but actually serve a specific communicative purpose. The debate got pretty heated, too. One non-native English speaker jumped in saying they put try and in the same category as should've. You know, those constructions that make you sound uneducated. But then the linguists in the thread pushed back hard on this, arguing that try and has been in use for centuries and follows its own consistent grammatical rules. It's not a mistake, it's a feature of the language that serves a different function than try to. There was this brilliant theory someone floated that maybe try and originated from people mishearing tryin' to, you know, with that dropped G and the way sounds blend together in casual speech. But the historical linguists shot that down pretty quickly, with examples going back way further than you'd expect. What really struck me about this whole discussion is how it reflects something we deal with constantly in tech: the tension between prescriptive rules and descriptive reality. It's like we have style guides and linting rules and best practices, but then there's how people actually write code and communicate. And sometimes what seems wrong according to the rules is actually serving a real purpose that the rules haven't caught up to yet. The thread also touched on regional variations, which is super relevant for anyone doing NLP work or building voice interfaces. Apparently, try and is way more common in British English than American English, though it exists in both. And get this, it only works with the base form of try. You can say try and do it, but not tried and do it or trying and do it. That's the kind of edge case that would absolutely break a naive grammar checker. Some folks in the comments were genuinely upset about this construction existing at all, while others were defending it as perfectly legitimate colloquial English. It reminded me of tabs versus spaces, or whether to use semicolons in JavaScript, these seemingly small choices that people have surprisingly strong feelings about. But unlike those debates, this one has actual linguistic research behind it, showing that both forms have their place and serve different communicative functions. The meta discussion was almost as interesting as the linguistic analysis itself. Here we have a bunch of engineers and programmers diving deep into grammatical minutiae, bringing the same analytical mindset they use for debugging code or optimizing algorithms. It's that classic Hacker News thing where a seemingly simple topic opens up into this complex, multifaceted discussion that touches on history, culture, cognitive science, and yes, even a bit of programming. And that wraps up yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. From massive privacy battles in Europe to Microsoft's security fumbles, from the wild world of free AI coding and heated debates about too little words. It's been quite a day in tech. What struck me most about yesterday's discussions is how they all, in different ways, touch on this fundamental tension between convenience and control, between trusting systems and understanding them, between following rules and breaking them when they don't make sense. Whether it's governments wanting to scan our messages, developers juggling dozens of AI tabs, or linguists arguing about grammar, we're all trying to navigate this increasingly complex digital world while maintaining some sense of agency and understanding. These were the 5 stories that rose to the top from the 30 that appeared on Hacker News yesterday, generating nearly 2,800 points and over 850 comments combined. The conversations are still going, the debates are still raging, and tomorrow we'll be back with a whole new set of stories that get the tech community fired up. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe try and keep your browser tabs under control. Or try to, whichever makes you happier. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.